Thank you, Paget. That was very generous of Paget. He's been very supportive of my work. And of course, this is my first visit to Antigua. And if it was not for his support, I would not be here. So I'm thankful for that opportunity. A few years ago, I wrote an article for the CLR James Journal on the political thought of Tim Hector. I was bored writing my dissertation, so I said, why don't we write an article about the political thought of Tim Hector? You see, I don't have much time to go out or anything like that, but I'm interested in these things. And I would like to kind of read the article to you, but with some updates of my research. And I'd like to discuss with you a focus on the intellectual history and the political thought of Tim Hector in light of a couple of propositions. You know, there's this great tradition of radical political thought from the late 60s and 1970s in the Caribbean. And Tim Hector is a representative figure of that generation that saw socialism and democracy in some very unique ways. He was not the only one, okay? But when we tend to look at the Caribbean radical tradition from 1968 to 1983, or from the Walter Rodney riots in Jamaica to the Grenada Revolution, that chronology, we tend to not understand the jewels of the political thought of the post-colonial moments. So figures such as Tim Hector, Buka Rennie and Wally Look Live, the New Beginning movement in Trinidad, Joseph Edwards, whose real name was George Myers, who was from Jamaica. These figures, and UC Quayana of Guyana, put forward a perspective that both national liberation in the Caribbean as well as socialism would be a vision of direct democracy and workers' self-management. It's very important to understand the profundity of these ideas and also why they have been neglected. You see, the majority of people think of democracy as majority rule. You go in the dictionary and it tells you democracy means majority rule. And then when you go to scholarly books that talk about democratic political theory, they say to you, well, in the dictionary it says majority rule, but everybody knows it's not majority rule. He said, but let's overcome objections for a moment. Who believes that democracy is really majority rule? And learned scholars like Robert Dahl of Yale will say, well, there's these few people, they're called anarchists. They're the only ones that take democracy seriously as majority rule. Everybody knows that democracy is minority rule, and that there are periodic elections where the majority rules on one day in November or a particular month in your country. For every 2 or 4 years, people press a button or whatever they do now to vote. I never participate in such things, however it works, okay? And they tell you that that is the yardstick of citizenship. And if you're not interested in the politicians of the particular parties, then you're not a good citizen. Tim Hector, following CLR James's ideas of direct democracy, said direct democracy, like socialism, was a vision of popular councils and committees and assemblies where ordinary people would be directly self-governing. They would take responsibility for all economic planning, judicial affairs, foreign relations, all educational and cultural matters. And there was this creativity in the ordinary people, where ordinary people were said to have the wisdom to govern society, and this was the foundation of their radical vision. This repeatedly came up in Tim's journalism, and these are the ideas that were so threatening to American empire and Anglo-American empire from 1968 to 1983. You can attend university and no one will talk about these things. You can be around movements for social justice and people will say, there was Walter Rodney, there was CLR, there was Fanon. It's like a citational discourse, kind of like Mount Rushmore or a Greek canon, where you say these great men, they existed, and maybe people will go read their stuff. But in party politics in the West Indies, CLR James who is not given credit really for theorizing the idea of a black radical tradition that in university life people talk about today. He said, you don't understand the tradition unless you understand the antagonisms within the radical tradition. Most people think, well, there's a radical tradition, there are these conservative politicians, there are these capitalist people, and maybe and the imperialists, and maybe the radical activists oppose those people. And today we use this word progressive. And we all know what that means in the United States, progressive. It means you support the president. You see, that's what progressive has come to mean. The evasion of putting forward a vision of the direct self-government of ordinary people. And so CLR was very clear that within the radical tradition there are debates among the leftists, among the radicals. And if you don't understand the debates among the radicals, you don't understand the tradition. And that's the context that we have to understand Tim Hector, not just as an amorphous radical, but someone with very unique ideas. And so I'm going to read my paper and present to you this concept that Tim was trying to legislate the Caribbean general will, or if you wish, the popular will. And as he cultivated that, he was trying to cultivate the will in light of visions of direct democracy and national purpose. A pageant over 2 decades, the later political thought of Tim Hector, native of Antigua, is an archive animated by the banners of direct democracy and national purpose. These motive forces shape a philosophy of history and craft perspectives informing Caribbean and world civilization. Pulsating at the heart of this corpus is a desire to legislate the general will of peoples of African descent towards self-government, breaking the shackles of white supremacy and the empire of capital. Outstanding among this endeavor is a perennial conjecture. Everyday people, Tim would often say, they don't know exactly what they want, but they instinctively and collectively aspire to sculpt a fragile and noble destiny. And this proposition was animated for Tim, or he learned these methods from the intellectual legacies of C.L.R. James, but also Jean-Jacques Rousseau, okay? And Tim, in his own innovative fashion, was trying to strive to fulfill his own mission, which I would argue was the founding of the polity of tomorrow. What I mean by that is that normally when we think of political science, as it was mentioned earlier, we think of, well, how does a bill become a law? What are the politicians doing? How are people going to get patronage from the government? But the polity of tomorrow in political philosophy is classically people ask questions about how to found, frame, and constitute the society they would like to live in. Okay? It's not just a normative discourse on how institutions that already exist work, but it's a projections and proposals for a new society. So Tim, wrestling with the idea of state power, what he perceives at times as self-hatred or corruption and methods to extend the vision and capacity of ordinary working people, his mature optics, his way of seeing, cannot finally be reconciled with notions of hegemony or a desire for progressive guardianship. For Hector understands ultimately democracy, like socialism, has no foundation without commitments to oppose all who would aspire to rule above society. His contribution to laboring, if you wish, a libertarian socialist or a aspiring stateless vision of direct democracy, as this is animating his Afro-Caribbean philosophy, had certain pillars. And you would see this in his journalism and his political statements. First, while appreciating aesthetic and city-state ideals associated with direct democracy of classical Athens, Tim attempts to shift the geography of reason of this imagined polity. See, Athens gives people a conception of what a small place, as Jamaica Kincaid would put it, or a small city-state, or what you can do through small committees and associations to govern yourself. And so he would look at the Athenian archive. But
He would also, and so he had to animate his vision of popular assemblies and committees. He also desired to place women and gender as central to vistas of Antiguan and Caribbean self-governance. He sought to reconstruct the embodiment of national purpose away from states and ruling classes toward the centrality of ordinary people's self-activity, which is a concept we should talk about some more, this idea of the ordinary people's self-activity, as James and Tim talked about it. And fourth, he begins to leaven a persistent clash between ideals of the Caribbean working classes' self-governing capacities and evidence of their lack of permanent desire for full responsibility for their nations, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Examining what for Hector is the dilemma of this epoch, which he termed pre-politics toward the end of his life, we will explore how ultimately this impacts our aspiring legislator of the Caribbean general will. Now, Tim, as many of you know, was a Caribbean integrationist, Pan-Africanist. He was an advocate of freedom of the press, an opposition leader, a fighter of fraud and unethical patronage. For decades, he was an adversary of V.C. Byrd and the Lester Byrd governments. Now, I don't know, y'all are from here, from Antigua. Imagine if someone discussed a radical tradition that included Lester Byrd or V.C. Byrd, if not Lester Byrd, and Tim together as part of the Caribbean radical tradition. If y'all had lived through the clashes between the Byrd regimes and Tim, you would probably find that odd, right? No? Well, something to think about. Well, subject to the consequences of his actions, he was jailed 11 times, and his periodical was sued at least 5 times. And you know that he was abroad in Canada. He attended Acadia University in Nova Scotia, and later in Montreal at McGill University. He was there around 1967, 68. And one thing I'd like to share with you about the intellectual archive of Tim is, as it was mentioned earlier by Aaron, there is this collection of intellectuals, diaspora intellectuals out of Canada that were part of fanning the flame of the Caribbean New Left, people who attended these Black Power and Black Writers conferences abroad, right? So you had people like Franklin Harvey, who was associated with the New Beginning movement. I think he's lived in Trinidad, but he's originally from Grenada. You had like Bobby Hill from Jamaica. Tim was there, Alfie Roberts from St. Vincent. And, you know, you can have this kind of anecdotal story of these representative figures who, of course, did a lot of writing and a lot of activism. But when Tim was studying with CLR in the study groups abroad, if you see the lectures collected by David Austin called You Don't Play with Revolution, CLR's private and public lectures from 1967 to 68 in Canada, you see Tim, you know, there's kind of like a transcript of the dialogue in there. And CLR had just come from working with the Workers and Farmers Party campaign, his only electoral campaign in his life, in Trinidad in 65, 66, which many people see as a heroic foreshadowing of the type of multiracial vision that was associated with the Black Power movement later in 1970. But in this period, CLR was not really teaching direct democracy or worker self-management as the foundation for Caribbean politics. And what we see in the transcript evidence is he would, when people like Franklin, who wrote a book critiquing party politics in Trinidad, or Tim, who later became an advocate of direct democracy in Antigua, when they would say, CLR, why can't there be direct democracy or worker self-management as the foundation, you know, in the third world politics? And he really, CLR had this bifurcation in his mind. He thought that the ordinary people in the Caribbean, though he would make populist statements, were not ready for direct self-government, direct democracy, worker self-management. And that's why he got caught up in this party politics with Eric Williams, right? And CLR has this conflicted legacy in the Caribbean and the third world. It was the Caribbean New Left, led by Tim Hector and others, that put forward the perspective that direct democracy and worker self-management could be the foundation of radical post-colonial thought in the Caribbean. if we flash forward to the legacy of the Grenada Revolution, I don't know how many of you know about Tim's perspectives on the Grenada Revolution. Of course, as has been suggested, he was a friend of Maurice Bishop, and we're all familiar that Maurice Bishop had a sad demise. He was assassinated, and of course, subsequently, the U.S. invaded Grenada. The New Jewel movement was known at its height for advocating popular assemblies or popular councils of direct self-governance. And those councils and assemblies, for those familiar with the Grenada Revolution, began to decline. They began to be a rubber stamp for an evolving one-party state. Tim was part of debates within the Caribbean New Left that suggested this was a terrible evolution of the situation in Grenada. Unfortunately, because of the radical tradition, it's not bad that the radical tradition critiques empire, that's very important, but sometimes in a perspective of a united front against the external enemy, we tend to have the debates within the radical tradition papered over. And so, you know, toward the end of Maurice's life, Tim and Maurice, I don't know if you guys know, weren't getting along too well. Because Tim pointed out that, in fact, there was a problem, despite what the imperialists were saying, about the suppression of freedom of the press in Grenada. There was a problem with political prisoners who could not transparently be brought to trial because there was no basis for them being detained. And Tim, within the Caribbean left, was one of the only spokespeople to talk about this in his journalism and among activist circles. And so if we have a kind of Caribbean radical iconography, right, with the big heads on it, the great men, right, all they did, and we say Tim, Maurice, and Walter, and we paper over the debates within the radical tradition that not only led to people dying, but also led to the suppression of the most radical vision for the direct self-government of the ordinary people. That's the part of the Grenada Revolution and the kind of analysis that's not talked about in scholarly literature or among activists today, but it must be brought out. Tim had the contradictions that CLR had in his own political thought. In some of his journalism, he would invoke William Hazlitt, the British writer, for his famous descriptions of the characteristics of a statesman, a successful statesman. You know, Mr. Hazlitt would say things like, statesmen have the obligation of they tend to be mediocre people, but they tend to manage people who are smarter and are more ethical than themselves. And the nature of a statesman is, as someone used the definition of politics earlier, is to facilitate what is said to be the art of the possible, right? But revolution is never thought to be possible among the majority of intellectuals, even radical ones, from the perspective of the direct self-government of ordinary people. And so Tim would often say, you know, there was a crisis of the Caribbean statesmen, which, you know, if you want to advocate direct democracy, there's no crisis of the Caribbean statesmen. They should just go away. Like, what job? There's no job for them, right? So there's this irony and nuance. You're going to have the direct self-government of the majority, but there's also a place for a minority to rule above society. And of course, Tim would ask, where are our Caribbean statesmen? And at times, he would find them, despite muted criticism that he had of them in Maurice and Michael Manley and Chetty Jagan and Fidel Castro. Of course, it was easier to criticize someone like Jamaica's Alexander Bustamante or Guyana's Forbes Burnham, but he really didn't see anything problematic in the authoritarian populism of Manley or Castro, who at various times were presented by the Caribbean New Left, right, as facilitating the self-government of working people, even though they suppressed the direct self-management of working people. So it's a dilemma that you see in Tim's thought, and it's consistent with the legacy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had this conception of legislating the general will. So if you look at C.L.R. James' Modern Politics, his book, he talks about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the idea of the social contract. And think about this, how it impacts Tim's ideas. If at any time the government behaves in a manner contrary to our original agreement, then all allegiance to it is ended. Each man is on his own again. Now that was a ferocious doctrine, C.L.R. said. Other men had written about the social contract before, people like Hobbes and Locke and others, but they had, most of them, made the contract in regard not only to the association of men, but a contract in regard to government. He says the contract is between us as a people to form a society. We don't have any contract with any government. This is C.L.R.'s interpretation of Rousseau. The contract is strictly between us. And the whole trend of this thought is that any time a government does not do what it is satisfactory, we are finished with it. The contract is broken. We have to start all over again. He said this is a doctrine of profound revolutionary implications. Oftentimes we're taught, I know in the United States this is the case, that there's a tradition of the founding fathers of the Constitution. They say, what were they thinking about when they founded our society, right? And I always try to tell my students, it doesn't matter what they were thinking about. The important thing is there's a tradition of founding, framing, and constituting a society of your choice. That you can sit down and decide what type of society you would like to build, what will be the terms of association, what will be the character of your institutions, and begin to build them. And within the Afro-Caribbean radical tradition, the direct democratic current, that's what they were saying, that's what Tim was saying about the Caribbean society, that you could found, frame, and constitute your own society on your own terms. And this is very inspiring to anybody who values these ideas in the world. How am I doing on time? Oh, good. Okay. So, now, at the same time, you have this problem with Rousseau's idea of the social contract that you see animated in Tim's ideas and C.L.R.'s ideas. There's this idea of legislating the general will or the popular will. You know, this term legislator is the term that Rousseau used, but they didn't mean like a parliamentarian, not that kind of legislator, but a philosopher that would observe the self-activity of ordinary people and, if you wish, sum up a mandate to represent their sovereignty. It was not strictly, as Rousseau said, a majority opinion. Neither was it necessarily the transparent views of the average person on the street. But one would observe, if you wish, the self-activity, the self-organization of ordinary people and try to sum up what their instincts were toward self-emancipation. And this philosopher-type figure would frame this in a way, perhaps observing art, music, literature, what people are doing at school, what they're doing in sports, and say, there's this instinct here to a higher calling, a higher purpose. And so you see that element in Tim's political thought. He would borrow from ancient Athens. He would borrow from stories of African history in his journalism. And he would try to project these ideals of the ordinary people's wishes to directly govern themselves. He would talk about maroon communities in Antigua, a free village movement. He would always be looking for representative anecdotes in popular literature, but also the history of the ordinary people to show and underscore their historical capacities to directly govern. He would talk about interpreting Jamaica Kincaid's literature or looking at representative women in Antiguan history like Elizabeth Thwaites. Thwaites Harts, Elizabeth Thwaites Harts, Nellie Robinson. He would look toward how independent women carried themselves, how they informally taught and organized the community, even though they weren't elected to anything, even though they were not official leaders. And he had this method that he picked up from C.L.R. James's book, Facing Reality. There was official society, and there was, if you wish, the repressed strivings of ordinary people, where this would be kind of unofficial history or what's really happening, the real experiences of ordinary people down below. He ran into trouble at the end of his life, though, because, and I'm going to come back to my article here, where, you know, he would speak to the ordinary people that he knew in Antigua, people that were not seen to be exceptional intellectuals or representative professional thinkers. And one woman said to him, the Antiguan government is as rotten as the people allow it to be. One Eastern villager tells Tim, as long as I'm all right, the devil can run the land. Hector, subject to criticism as leading an ineffective opposition, asks, why blame the opposition? The corrupt Byrd regime in the last 3 electoral campaigns had in fact increased their share of the vote. But on the other hand, the ACLM was so engaged in exposing corruption and calling for government accountability that they did not take seriously being elected to office. And a lot of ACLM supporters, I was talking to Lukey about this last night, were disturbed by this, because even though Tim would teach the ordinary people that they should arrive on their own authority, people would respond to Tim like a lot of radical thinkers. They say, this guy Tim is a nice guy. It would be nice if he was president. You know, so people hear the direct democratic ideas, but they take that as Tim's genuineness, defense of their humanity, but they don't seem to arrive on the conclusion of this project of direct self-government. And one elderly woman tells Tim, you better face reality. People are weird now. That's a reference to CLR's book, Facing Reality, right? You better face reality. They are a now and now generation. They don't give a damn about corruption. Once they get a piece of the action, listen to the young people talk about South Africa. The very government they will vote for willingly sent arms to the white South Africans. You think they care? And they were talking about in relation to Vera Byrd's regime. You think if Vera Byrd gives them a job to build a sidewalk and they work for 2 hours and get paid for 8 hours, you think they care? Answer me, man. The trouble with you, she said, is you have faith in the people. I do not. Don't you think when the prime minister appears on TV, the people don't know it is a bunch of lies? They switch it off. But the same people prefer government by lies. Then you all making an honest effort to educate people and put them in charge, quote, of their own development, as you like to say. So this was the incorporation of what the ordinary people were saying to Tim, and he incorporated that into his journalism. Normally, Tim would not incorporate that type of voice into his journalism, because that would present the people as under hegemony, unfit for self-government, false consciousness, selfish, not collective-minded. So you see that Tim's vision or philosophy of direct democracy is a stylized vision. This is a major problem in the study of the radical political thought of the Caribbean New Left. I don't have the answer for this, but it's something I've been working on lately. You see, for the purposes of agitation and propaganda, it is necessary, and I think indispensable and ethical, to speak of the ordinary people's wisdom to directly govern, their latent understanding of historical problems, their elemental drives, their repressed strivings to arrive on their own authority. There's a kind of, if you wish, continuum where you use this rhetoric, the self-organization of the people, the self-realization of the people. You know, the people don't talk about their own self-realization and self-organization, right? I mean, no one refers to their own activity as self, self, self. So there's a kind of method of mediation in legislating or cultivating the popular will where Tim and others would sum up at best the self-governing instincts of the ordinary people, and one would have to leave out not the only reality, but an aspect of reality that suggested there were elements of corruption, lack of integrity, limitations on people's educational capacities, formal or informal, to actually understand the problems that they face. And there's a way that this kind of it can become a populism. You know, and this is a tricky word, populism, because populism is a kind of thing where politicians imply that they want the ordinary people to govern, but in fact, of course, they're running for office to be the minority that rules above society. So anybody could give a speech in that way. The legacy of Tim's political thought is that Tim was not committed to being a minority that ruled above society. That was the vast trajectory of the archive of his most radical political thought. As some of you know, toward the end of his life, there were some electoral coalitions. There were some arrangements made to be transparently get caught up in the representative government and elections. And this vision of direct democracy and self-management was subordinated toward the end of his life. I don't think that should define Tim's radical political thought, but I think for those that remember those times and experience those times, particularly the older people who remember the radical political thought before that historical moment, we need to make a contribution to summing up at its best and at the limitations Tim's vision of direct democracy and worker self-management. If we allow that to get caught up in amorphous conceptions of social justice, where there's a radical tradition where there's a, as CLR used to say, right, there's a place for all at the rendezvous of victory. It's like someone has to say, no, there's not. There's not a place for all at the rendezvous of victory. The victory of arriving in state power as the minority that rules above society cannot authentically sustain the direct self-government of ordinary people. It can only create dependent participatory relations at best, and when the people arrive on their own authority, asking their own questions, taking their own initiatives, putting forward their own perspectives and proposals, the state has to shoot them down. The state and the ruling class cannot share legitimacy with the self-governing ordinary people. And so Tim at his best was someone that propagated, if you wish, the destruction of bureaucracy or hierarchy above the people, even people that claim to be progressive, that claim to speak on behalf of labor, and tried to teach people that they needed to arrive on their own authority. And so I think that's the legacy that we need to research more, conserve, and extend and enhance for the next generation. So I thank you.